never sits in the front row. Ever. I'm gonna take a picture at every event. Just be like.
So the queer ancestors.
Hey, let's do that.
Holy saints. Okay. Right, we are live. So, welcome everyone to Querying Bodies, Texts on Trauma, Transformation, and Truth with Elias Kerr and Billy R. Tadros. Give it up. Scranton's in the house. My name is Greg Newton. I'm the co-founder, along with my partner, Donnie Jokum, of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, which is the space you find yourselves in right now. So the Bureau is an all-volunteer queer bookstore, independent of the center. We started in 2012. We've been at the center since 2014. And we have regular business hours, Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. And then we often stay open late when we have events. And on weekends, we like a nice afternoon.
Yeah.
Let's just get home early, among other things. We are all volunteer, as I mentioned, so that means we're always asking for a little money. So I'm going to pass this bag around. There's some change in here. So we always say, give what you can if you can. There's also a QR code for Venmo if you want to do that. And if the other option is, if you'd like to support us by buying books, that's a wonderful thing to do. And that way you're supporting poets, writers of all kinds. So I will leave those options for you to sit with. For those of you online, if you'd like to donate on Venmo, you can do that at BGSQD. Now you can see those letters on the boxes. And if you're not already on our email list and you would like to be, you can sign up for that at the back of the room or on our website, bgsqd.com. So before I introduce Elias and Billy, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement and a call for a ceasefire in Gaza. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. We also want to recognize that today, May 4th, is the 211th day of Israel's genocidal campaign against the Palestinian people, funded by our tax dollars and enabled by our government's unwavering support. We hope that you will join us in calling for an immediate, permanent ceasefire, an end to the siege, and an end to the occupation in order to stop the collective punishment of Palestinians and to ensure the swift delivery of desperately needed food, water, medicine, fuel, and humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. So first up, Elias Kerr is a transmasculine poet who writes under the pen name E. Kerr. They graduated from the University of Scranton in 2023 with a master's degree in occupational therapy and double minors in English and writing. They are the recipient of the inaugural 2022 Stemler Dennis LGBT & Award. Their work has been featured in various publications, including Rappahannock Review, I hope I did that some justice, Another Chicago Magazine, and the Hollands Critic, and their debut collection, Trans Reincarnation, was released in April 2023 with Mason Jar Press. Kerr lives and writes in Scranton, Pennsylvania with their cat, Nola. Please give it up for Elias. Good height.
I think so.
Yeah.
I hope so. So I'm going to be reading from my debut collection, Trans Reincarnation, which was released last April. And the first piece that I'm going to read is called I Am Neither Your Daughter Nor Son. I am neither your daughter nor son. When you try to find this, and I know you will try to find this, Mother tells me I am delayed whenever I act out, but I was not taught how to express socially appropriate emotions. And she hates that I dress like the son she didn't want. I was born an orchid, but needed to become the vines I wrap my throat in, choke back the words I wish I spat out, instead of pretending to be delicate for her. I will tip my skin to try to find peace in that red honey, because blood is the only thing we all have in common. It doesn't know boy, girl, or anything in between. Like family, love, all the lies, she tells me I am hers to bleed forever. So this next piece I'm going to read is written in a form called the duplex form, which was coined by Jericho Brown. And basically it is similar to a sonnet in that there's 14 lines, and the first line is a dovetail from the previous line. Duplex crucifixion after Jericho Brown. Bring me closer to your God. I don't want to leave this world damned. I want to leave this damned world. Hang me on your wall with 2 tacks. With 2 tacks, you hang me on your wall, and my palms bleed until they've dried out. The blood on my palms has dried, thick like dollops of paint. Paint me with your dollops, thicker than wine you drink to forget blame. Forget that you drank the wine. Blame precedes forgiveness for all your sins. I forgive you for all your sins. Am I closer to your God? The next piece I'm going to read is actually a sestina poem. So it has 6 parts where the end words of each line repeat in a certain pattern. And then the 7th part is a collection of all those end words in three lines. Transcreation myth, a sestina written after a year knowing this body, after Caleb Ray Candrilli. 1. The world began on the brink of a Tuesday morning, 20-something years ago. My mother spent 40 hours creating my world and would spend another few thousand trying to take it all back. You know this by now. My mother did not want a firstborn son and would rather watch me suffer in living out her lie. 2. I recite verses from scripture to the ceiling as I lay between cycles of sleep and prayer. I wish to be Sunday, morning mass, and receive a blessing from every holy person. Even in this trans body, they will call me their brother, but take their words back when the service comes to an end. 3. Our bodies will always come to an end, and even then they will find a way to put us on display. When you are trans, there are some things you can never get back. I've accepted that there will come a day when I will have to face my mother again, and she will ask me what I've done to her daughter. 4. My body has been declared a treason by other bodies who refuse to learn or comprehend. I have spent so much time searching for another metaphor, looking for them to understand. I rely on hope and holding my breath every day. There is no way to rewrite their genesis. There is no way to go back. 5. My baptism is a daily event. I rub the backs of my arms, declare Holy Spirit after the Father and the Son. Say a prayer that I look enough like myself today. This ritual will soon see the ends of needles, and I know I will be called a liar by my God-fearing mother. 6. There are moments I cannot recall with my mother. Her violence reveals itself only in the form of flashbacks, and I am left questioning if this silence makes it all a lie. You need to know my mind is a prison. Stay, and even in heaven, my sentence will not end. My shame, like her lessons, cannot be left in yesterday. 7. The world begins again every year. Another trans person will reject the biblical poison from the lips of their mother, begging for them to come back. We are sick and we are tired of having to pretend that we do not know enough about our bodies, laying on our backs, flat, and praying for an end to today. This next piece I'm gonna read is called My Therapist Wants Me to Write About Hope. It's a very funny title. My therapist wants me to write about hope, but isn't my standing here testament enough? For 5 years, I've collected loose leaf feathers to forage wings, rummaged through piles of swallow and gull carcasses, searched for quills to penetrate my skin. I know my Nana will read these poems and say she sees Satan in the red remains of a vulture's wake. I know my father will start to see me in his mirrors, molting what no longer serves me. My mother refuses to let me ascend. She clips my remages every time they grow back. I will grow back again. This last piece that I'm going to read is a longer piece, and it's actually the title of the collection, Trans Reincarnation, and it's written as a crown of sonnets, which is 14 sonnets where the first line of each sonnet is the last line of the previous one, and then the 15th sonnet is the collection of all those first last lines. Trans Reincarnation. 1. I am home again, and this body found ways to make meat and connective tissue nourish itself for so long, a cadaver I won't take back. My mother wishes I'd put what God gave me to good use, and when I trusted a scalpel over his plans, she made it her devotion. She devoured me like scripture, fixated on sins and saving, scraps of that carcass, collecting cuts of rib and breast, offering a sacrifice to a God I will never meet, instilling the fear of an expiration date. 2. I used to have an expiration date scribbled before jagged suture lines, my surgeon script playing poet, and I would let her revise me into this world again and again. Did she feel like a mother to all the men she saved? I spent my 21st birthday doped up on Oxycontin and gender euphoria, attention bound around my ribcage and its lack of restraint, defined what the word habituate meant. Was this body syntax always foreign to me? Was I always meant to be an island, floating far from crowded mainland bodies? 3. Crowd the mainland with bodies like mine, call us disease, genetic mutations. Every trans person knows we are able to survive against our diagnosis. We wear capes like our childhood superheroes, but hide our powers instead of using them to save others. People disguise things they're afraid of, spiders and snakes. It all comes down to fear. We are afraid of what we refuse to understand, what can't be understood through language, spelled out in sequentialist font, decorated to distract from a weight heavier than loose leaf paper. 4. The weight of her body holding me down made me want to shed consciousness like a snake skin, wholly in a way out. She wore my keratinocytes like silver rings, one for every night she took from me, a collection of anniversaries I don't want to remember, years of Phil calendars. Once I was skinned, she had no use for me. Who wants to dig through bio waste for treasure? I wasn't dead yet, but had I kept myself from ecdysis, she would have worn my body like a medal. 5. I wore my first medal when my body was faster than the boys. I say my body and not myself because I refuse to fill a skin someone else prescribed, labeled first. My grandmother watched me flip the victory coin in the sunlight, catching like my cousin's eyes when he couldn't beat me. Years later, I sat and watched barefoot children run the same burnt lawns we did, fight for the same tinfoil and ribbon prize in desperation. We were sweat-drenched, disappointed, our bodies unshowered in praise, bleeding to beat. 6. I showered after she beat me, bled me into drains to wash away witness, as if water could forget my body and all the bruises the way she did. This baptism, God telling me to clean myself up, apologized for letting her put her hands on me. Even he gave up on me that night, tried to rinse the violence off. She was the last person to suffocate my breastbone before it was freed, and she left a lasting impression for the hands that reconstructed it years later. 7. Years later, I reconstruct my body. Bleached blonde hair, skipped meals, needles with permanent ink. I want to be anabolic, I want to be bloodstreamed. I was filling up with nightly prayers to save the soul, looking back at this body in the mirror. If God isn't willing to help me be more like him, I'll reincarnate myself into new spirits. My mother deems this double-scarred sin sacrilege, self-injected sin. You can't repent this decision. Do you know the damage you've done to this body? I could ask you the same thing. 8. Do you know the damage you've done to our bodies? This is a story we all know by now. Bare-chested, trans bodies fighting not to end up planted in the dirt or return to ashes. I grow peonies for every dream I have where someone I love is killed in front of me, and I cannot stop the bullets from entering. My gardens can't keep blood from breaking like sweat, and flower petals are only beautiful when you're alive to see them, not when they decorate a body's grave. 9. If a body is a grave, what are we burying? My mother never mourned her first dead daughter, and sometimes I ask myself if that would have made this transition easier on her. My childhood home is a memorial for each of my past selves. The pink bucket hat and crooked toothed smile, the pile of too small uniforms, the bin of broken crayons. I pushed too hard against white walls, trying to make damage done to them beautiful, trying to undo what she had done to me. 10. I hadn't done enough to save her, couldn't stop her from scratching her shades of red and violation into my skin. My therapist warned me that 7 years is a long time to keep saying the same prayer over and over again, but I will tattoo it to my tongue if it means I can believe it one day. I still haven't recovered my skin. I found plywood and collaged half-bent nails to hold something in its place. I became sculpture from broken canvas, dimensional like the wound she left, probed at with pincer grasps, cast in mishandled mercury in the same position she'd struck me. 11. Lightning can strike the same place twice. My mother knew this and chose to isolate her eldest child. I stood out like a feather among browning leaves. I floated, wasn't willing to fall, weightless to the ground below, her shoes crinkle under the weight of her leathered slipper soles. My first love knew this too, and rolled in under silent gray sheets, luminous until she became electric, neutral until she was charged. I should have predicted their spiny strands by the shifting winds. I should have expected the bolts from the blue rims of healing bruises. 12. The blue rims of pen-planned incision points wrote me into this world like that glum May day nearly 24 years ago. The nurses gathered to watch the surgeon cast ink like a god, deciding where to cut the crust of a terrestrial body. I come from a collection of choices I had no say in choosing. Humans want to be autobiographical, but instead end up third-person points of view, and transgender people will authorize further revisions to these narratives, consent to being born into their own anatomy. 13. We are born anatomical, structurally separated into chasms of tissue and bolts of venous pathways, and somehow this flesh can feel so foreign. I believe others who claim to know my skin better than I do, who spend time examining where to place the next blemish, while I run out of layers to cover them all up. I am vulnerable to these blunt traumas. I learned the word no a few touches too late, was poked and prodded on beds instead of operating tables, then discarded among cadavers, meandering further away from myself, but still I always found my way back. 14. The birds always found their way back to the wire, and I wondered how precipitation didn't beat them to the ground. But then I remember I spent years in similar downfalls. My mother's house had an atmosphere of its own, and through those storms, I learned to swim, only after I learned to drown. I learned to rekindle fire after being smothered and put out, nothing but embers and loaded bullet cavities. I wanted to warn the birds when I watched for sun-swallowing warnings. I wanted to reach them, even if it meant throwing stones to scare them off. 15. My mother threw stones, hoping to scare me off. I was expiring in land, filled mainly with bodies. The weight of them wore on me, beat me through shower drains, deconstructed my body, and they still don't know the damage they've done. They still don't know my body has become a grave. But now I'm enough to save myself from being struck on the same bruises, healing in rims of blue anatomy. The birds found a way back. This body and I are home again. Thank you.
Thank you, E, for adding your voice to our space.
Thank you.
Billy R. Tatros is an associate professor in the Department of English and Theater at the University of Scranton, where she also teaches in the Women's and Gender Studies program and directs the concentration in health humanities. She earned her PhD in English from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, my region of the country. We'll talk more. And her MFA in writing from Sarah Lawrence College, Greg. And she is a graduate of the Writers Institute at Susquehanna University. She is the author of 3 books of poems, Graft Fixation, Goldwake Press, 2020, Was Body, Indolent Books, 2020, and The Tree We Planted and Buried You In, Otis Books, 2018. Please welcome Billy to the mic.
Hi, folks. Good afternoon. I'm so grateful to be sharing this space with y'all, especially with E. And thanks so much to the Bureau for hosting us. So I'm going to read a little bit from my 2 more recent collections, Was Body and Graft Fixation. So they both came out in the middle of the pandemic. And then I'm going to close with 2 newer poems that are kind of in the same thematic territory. So Was Body is what I'll read from first. And when I'm joking about it, I like to call it a book of lesbian breakup poems. When I'm being more serious, I say it's a book about queer grief. And then Graft Fixation follows the aftermath of a car accident that I was in that effectively ended my recreational running career. So by way of introduction, I want to share my favorite definition of metaphor, which comes from an essay by poet Alicia Ostreicher. And she says that the pleasure we take in metaphor is a pleasure of consent, an agreement that the distance between 2 things is cancelable because of their likeness, whereby each illuminates some inner truth belonging to the other. So I'm going to try to cancel a few distances this afternoon between a number of seemingly disparate things for the purposes of illuminating truths about each of them. And so those things primarily are going to be poems about loving women who didn't love themselves, poems about my father's gun suicide, and poems about the bodily injury following a deep, very queer love for running, through which I sought both to outrun my grief and I think to outrun my femininity. So I'm going to start with some poems from Was Body. All right, so this is called Voicemail on Your Birthday, 3 years after you didn't do it. Because it's morning now in that backyard and the river is cresting, and soon the floodwaters will be at the door of the cafe, I'm calling to tell you happy birthday and I'm sorry. Your eyes were always gravity and I never knew where to put my hands. That's why I looked at you with that green immediacy when you sleepwalked your way into your car and drove to the grocery store. When you came, you writhed with seizure, so that winter was ecstatic. Danger, like how you would stick your fingers inside me, then hold them like triggers against your skull, mouth goodbye, over and over in sleep. Thanks, y'all. The next one I'm going to read is called Because a Line Has No Endpoint, and it's in 6 short sections. 1. If I tell you it hurts, I presume you'll ask where. The spangled bruise on my inner thigh, pointillistic. I'll tell you, I threw my fist at it this week to keep it tender. It's my only lasting impression of your lips. 2. I know how to fire a gun, you say, when I indicate the healed points of his contact, now flesh color cooling. You kiss each gently, and I recall our first night over blueberry table wine, how I told you my father put a pistol in his mouth, how yours taught you to shoot, how both of these were lessons in survival. 3. We talk about lines. You draw one from me with 2 fingers. Later, You put the same 2 fingers to the back of your throat, cry empty. 4. We make desperate emptying, love in your loft bedroom for the first time in 11 months, both saying still, still. I take your hand down my side between hip and breast, tell you a tattoo artist in Pittsburgh will render a line there next month. You always talked about lines. 5. You fell asleep, still drunk, on wine, skin, water. You taste like water, you say, like mead. I wake to your spastic intakes of breath, hear the churning in your stomach, wonder if you've eaten this week. I dream of asphyxiation. In the morning, I ask you if you're hungry. Thirsty, you say, filling the well beneath my rib cage. Parched. 6. We sit outside the coffee shop parallel to the river, whispering words on each other's palms with our fingertips. Because I am leaving, I think of my father. Because I am leaving, you look at me and say, still. Because I am leaving, your eyes look just like his. I think this is the oldest poem I'm going to read that's from this collection, just as a fun fact. So this is called Hollandaise. You pour the sauce into glass bowls beside the summer colors of your salad. Take your routine 3 bites, touch your tongue to the fork, tip and nod. It's perfect. Smooth, viscous. Find that the stove needs tending until I have finished eating. Insist that you have had enough. You separate the rest of the yellows and whites, and I do not say anything. I take larger forkfuls, make a spectacle of my appetite as if this will make you want. The flavor is metallic and lemon, sour and smells of consequence. I am starting to know. Not when you disappear after dinner, but when you clap out your rug, reorganize your pens, retract, when you recoil at my fingers above your hips, retract, when you try to explain that it's not about size, that it's not about weight, that you feel fluttered. This is what it looks like. The fresh yolk of an egg, bright yellow and semi-solid, the illusion of containment in cupped hands, but while you're sending it between palms, interlaced sieve fingers, trying to make something out of a center, what's left falls silently between the spaces and pools on the countertop. These are remnants. What I mean to suggest is that we sift ourselves to nothing. So I'm going to read one more from this collection. It's actually in 3 parts. So the first part of it is called Again Running, and I'm going to put on my 2nd grade teacher for a second here. So it starts as a prose poem, so it's this block on the page. And then gradually it erases itself. So the next version goes from again running to gunning, and then that looks like this. So the block gradually disappears. And then the 3rd version is further disappeared and called un. So again running. In the morning, the vessel's thick at the periosteum in case I surround you, bones. Your body is a sheep thinning from waking when you're tallest. I remember my father in the kitchen in his underwear, his bakery apron folded over the chair. You were a child then, in a state with mountains, learning the layers. I was decorating cupcakes, sometimes in the bakery. This was my histology, learning how to write aorta over and over again with a pastry bag. You were eating or you were not. It was nervous, the sciatica after the 18-wheeler on the interstate, but my father knew only the word for joints. You were in Colorado with your hands on either side of the fault lines. I fault, I fault, I fault. He had a word for it in his other language, but it also meant tongue. His tongue had deep fissures. He told me not to jump from the kitchen table like that. His tongue had deep fissures from his teeth. He jumped. I can see him jumping from the window in that room, his brother behind him burning, the scar on his tongue like a sear. 40 years later, I was running, you were eating, or you were not. My father with the scar on his tongue like a sear on the interstate. You were in Colorado with your hands. I was there and I was not dying. my patella was wearing. You were thinning, he was wearing my favorite shirt. I was running, the morning was hot like a sear. We were all alone. He was waiting, the pistol sear, whose fault? My tongue ached thick as I ran. He waited the sear, the pistol against the scar on his tongue. The mouth, the lead encased the vessels thick at the cranial bones. He was tallest in the morning. You were in Colorado, or you were not dying. I saw the fault lines in my knee running. Whose fault? Gunning. Morning vessels thick, I surround your body when I remember my father folded over the chair. You were layers. I was sometimes histology, learning how to write aorta over and over again. You were eating. You were nervous. Sciatica after 18, but knew only the word for joints. You were Colorado with fault lines. I fault, I fault, I fault. A word for language, but it also meant tongue. Deep fissures. He told me not to, like deep fissures from his teeth. I can see him in that room burning like a sear. 40 years later, I was eating, you were not. My father with the scar on his tongue like a sear. You were Colorado with your hands. I was my patella wearing. You were my favorite. I was running, hot like a sear alone. He, the pistol, whose fault? My tongue ached as I ran the pistol against the mouth bones. He was tallest in the morning. You were, or you were dying. I saw lines in my knee. Whose fault? And then finally, vessels surround your body when I remember you were layers. I was learning how to write aorta over you. You were nervous, sciatica. You were Colorado with fault. I meant tongue deep. I can see that room burning like a sear. 40 years later, you were not like a sear. You were hands. You were hot like the pistol whose fault ached mouth bones. You were dying. Lines. My fault. So I'm going to switch happy gears and now read poems about a motor vehicle accident. I blame E. They came up with the title for this event. I'm just playing. So the first poem I'm going to read from Graph Fixation is called Accident Report as Homophonic Translation. And so it's playing a lot with homophony, with sound, but specifically it borrows some lines from my actual accident report, and then it riffs on them and kind of reinvents them. So accident report as homophonic translation. The passenger stated she was facing west. The driver's face was in the wheel, or the driver's face was in the well of his passenger's body, or the car was a well. The driver stated he was unable to avoid impact. When the investigating officer arrived on scene, it was asphalt, and he said, well. The passenger said that she was well, or the passenger said that she was a well. She was emptied. The emergency medical technician emptied the passenger from the well of the car and said that she was well. When the investigating officer arrived on scene, it was as fault. Upon initial contact with the driver, the investigating officer noted an odor of alcohol emitting from his person and asked him to step out. The driver said he was thirsty. The woman was no longer his passenger. She admitted that she was not his person. The driver said he couldn't stop the vehicle. He admitted that she was not his person. The driver said he couldn't negotiate the turn. The passenger was transported by ambulance. She would not walk. The treating physician's report said that she was well. The road was a wound that swelled around what was left, the vehicle. The driver was turning left into an intersection. The driver turned their bodies into an intersection. The investigating officer reported that the passenger stated she was well. She was restrained and she had no complaints. She was no longer a passenger. She was admitted. She was a road or a well or a wound. a well-written wound. So I stole the title for this next poem from some online dictionary's definition of cannibalize. And anyway, the title is "Cannibalizing two broken down cars might provide spare parts to make one working car." And just for a little levity, every poem in this book initially had only 1 or 2 words per title. And my editor was like, "Billy, just as an experiment, why don't you see if you can revise the titles so they're all at least 3 words long?" There is now 1 poem in this book titled Graph Fixation, 2 words, and the rest are beasts like this nonsense. It just gets worse from here, y'all. Anyway. So cannibalizing 2 broken down cars might provide spare parts to make one working car. When I ask her to define forgiveness, my therapist suggests that I write you a letter, but I neither want to forgive you nor to give you anything else. My knee gives. The epistolary, after all, is all about response, or the absence of response. After my first surgery, when the numbness of the skin surrounding the surgical site became sensate again, I learned that there was something erogenous about my response to the touch of that scar tissue that marked where part of my patella had been harvested and repurposed. All right, and this is where reading from this book starts to get a little bit weird. So I'm actually skipping all of the poems that are highly visual. I've got my MRI images in here, which is kind of fun. You can only really do like the 2nd grade teacher thing though. So I'm gonna skip those, but there's also a bunch of poems that have footnotes, and this is one of them. So the way that I'm gonna handle that is I'm just gonna indicate when I hit a footnote, but I'm gonna read the text of the poem through. And then I'm gonna return to those lines where the footnotes appear and read you the footnotes after. So this is called Hymen after significant frontal impact. And one other fun fact, so hymen is not just a word that refers to anatomy, but it's also a word that's related to marriage. So a poem celebrating marriage often also has the word hymen. So this is hymen after significant frontal impact. Oh, one other thing. So some of these poems in this book, and this is one of them. Back in 2013, there was a group of grad students, I think they were at MIT, but they put together this app called What Would I Say? And it would run this algorithm in which it would take the body of everything you've ever posted to Facebook, horrifying, but it's already out there, right? And it would produce texts that sound like what you would say using the words you yourself had used, but reordering them, right? So for some poems in this project, I sat there for a few hours and just hit, what would I say? What would I say? And took the text and lineated it. So this is one of them. Last night, an error, the smell of scarred tissue when I sleep, and pretending this is when I fell the 2nd time. In fact, it is a crucial boundary between fiction and endurance. The former feels the ache, and the pockets are fantastic. I can't keep finishing the floor with allografts. A crucial boundary between fiction and endurance. 1. When I knew him, the man who later plied me with whiskey, coerced me into his vehicle, and then crashed that vehicle into the back of another vehicle. He would coyly introduce his work with the claim that everything he wrote was nonfiction, quote, because it happened to him. The ache, 2. There's evidence to suggest that women runners can differentiate between good pain and bad pain. Such a differentiation might colloquially be called, quote, listening to one's body. Some women runners experience a great tension between their desire to push through bad pain and their understanding of what their bodies are telling them to do. But desire is not consent. I can't keep finishing. 3. This isn't a letter. Even nonfiction is fictive, and it didn't happen to him. This is called Accident Report as Post Hoc Ergo Propter Hoc. So for folks who have repressed memories of learning about logical fallacies, the Latin here is the one in which you assume that because one thing happened after another thing, the first thing caused it. Accident report as post hoc ergo propter hoc. This time we're in the spillway, or we're surrounded, and I can see the meniscus curve against the panes. We lower the glass, watch the pit fill and pulse. That day you found me in the pool, this is what I was doing. Right before you entered me, I thought of water displacement. I practiced, exhaling the whole time, and butterfly kicked for the wall. I was afraid to write stroke because of the emergency room, so I clipped your lines. I crisped like impacted metal or oven-baked pork skin that convected heat like the heavy breath of your stopped car. The smell of barbecue may have been coming from the radiator or from the backyard party we had just left. I'm gonna read 2 more from this book and then I'll close with 2 newer ones. So I had to read a therapist poem because I figured you were gonna read your therapist poem. So this is, my therapist wants to know what it was exactly that running did for me. And this one has footnotes. So I try to explain what used to happen before. The insistent, sharp lateral ache, the ghost crunch of articular cartilage, the longing thirst of inhaling morning humidity, the agency of proprioception. A researcher asks me about my running tattoos. I tell her I am theorizing the erotics of running. I tell the researcher I would give up orgasms for marathons. The agency of proprioception, 1. I tell my wife I don't know how to live in this body anymore. Theorizing the erotics of running, 2. When I talk about this, I refer to Audre Lorde's The Uses of the Erotic as Power, in which Lorde defines the erotic for women as, quote, a considered source of power and information within our lives, as a resource, as, quote, that power which rises from our deepest and non-rational knowledge. Lorde concedes that there is a hierarchy of the erotic, that, quote, there is a difference between painting a back fence and writing a poem, but only one of quantity, insisting that she finds no difference, quote, between writing a good poem and moving into sunlight against the body of a woman she loves. Oh, shockingly, I can't read my handwriting. One second. I was doing so well. This is called Hymen with Nerve Block. And this one has 2 footnotes as well. Love, you have ruptured my last name. I do know how I felt about this woman. We both slept in vain, woke up reminded that we married in the operative dream of moving like a runner again. And this was from that What Would I Say stuff too. So I do know how I felt about this woman. 1, see wound. We both slept in vain, woke. 2, I was under anesthesia and salt, asphalt, asphalt, assault. I'm just going to read 2 more. These are newer. So this is called Sonnet for the Physical Therapist Who Told Me This Is Just the Way the Good Lord Made Me. The graft's fixed, but you can't fix me. My load-bearing walls thicken like they're uterine, and then collapse, a deluge. It's a sin to desire different architecture, I'm told. But Lord, we're at least jointly to blame. You gave me this body, which gave me my name, its form preceding its content. You want me on my knees, but won't bend yourself. Can't. Or canto, I sing your refusals. Don't. Think for a second, I'll forget. I won't. The echo of him in hymn and hymen resonate long after communion. I'd sit in the pew, follow the contours of your splayed arms, wish mine were more like yours. And then I'm going to close with 1 more, and this one has a super, super long title. And I'll give you a little bit of context first. So 2 pieces of context. My father's first language was Arabic. And when I was 10 years old, we had this bookstore called the Happy Booker near our house, and I walked in and I saw this book that said, "Learn Arabic quick and easy in 2 weeks." And I had this bright peach cover, and I said, "Yes, I'm gonna do that." And so I went home with the book, and then what happened was I've got English characters on one side of the page matched with Arabic characters showing me phonetic pronunciation, except for 4 of the characters, it just said no English correspondence. The other quick story is that when my father used to go to IHOP, he'd order a coffee, and without fail, every time he took a sip of it, the first sip, he'd say, "This coffee sucks." And at the time, as a kid, like I really didn't understand, why do you keep ordering it then, right? And like I do get it now. So anyway, the title of this poem is "Because He Never Taught Me, I Bought an English Arabic phrase book, but next to 4 of the characters in the column representing phonetic pronunciation, the editors had written no English correspondence. So I don't know the word for how tired I am in my father's language, but I suspect he would be disappointed in this coffee, all weak and bodiless. All week, I've been trying different ratios of browns to water and trying on different bodies. We are always never the same. Sometimes I think of my sex as a barrel, clit as a hammer, but I always devolve into the same old puns. I can't find my release. I need to get a grip. Neither my father nor I knew the words for gender dysphoria, but that doesn't mean we didn't know. I don't know the word for exhaustion in my father's language, but my partner tells me she thinks I have a sleep disorder, and I know my father never completed that sleep study. Sometimes I can understand the false affordances of an exhaust pipe, his handgun. I don't know which one of us was triggered first, the week after he died, when my best friend called, "Shotgun!" We both stopped dead in our high school parking lot before she hit the second syllable. And I laughed in circles. I laughed in cylinders. For so long, his suicide was circadian, which is to say that every day was the same, stale coffee. Sometimes I still wake at 4 a.m., something my partner attributes to something called sleep inertia, and something I attribute to heredity. I don't know the word for sleep in my father's language, or if the verb is conjugated differently when the subject leaves or when the leaving is pathological. I used to say he was not well. I used to say he walked out. I used to say objects in motion and objects at rest. But now I question all notions of inertia and why I never thought to tuck him in myself. I don't know the word for immigrant in my father's language, but I do know that to rest is to settle, that we are cognate in at least one sense of the word, that the Dead Sea is pocked by sinkholes, and I've found no other term for a casket lowering device but depression. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy and Eli. We have books by both of our poets at the back. And please stay, take a look around. Thank you. Thanks, everyone online.